Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Crisis Studies and Mitigation at the University of Manchester, I want to welcome you to the start of what we hope will be an exciting seminar series. My name is David Schultz, and I'm a professor of synoptic meteorology and principal investigator of the center. The purpose of our center is to bring together different researchers across the university who are all working on natural hazards and their impacts on society. This is the first seminar in our series, and I'm pleased to be able to kick it off. I want to first thank Dr. Pons Suvanaseng of our center for selecting the speakers, organizing and advertising the seminar series, and also Chris Higson of the University Media Services for his assistance in getting us online. As you can see on the screen, we have a great selection of speakers for the next few weeks. And we're working on other seminars, and we should be going for the indefinite future. We'll have other speakers later in the summer, like Professor Susan Cutter and Professor Kathleen Sherman-Morris later in the summer or the fall. So if you're interested in these, make sure to register through our website. You can follow us on Twitter or check out our website for event updates and the videos that we'll post after the fact if you can't make it live. Our next seminar is going to be Dr. Rob DeLeo from Bentley University, and his talk is called Always Unprepared: How Politics Undermines Disaster Preparedness and What to Do About It. Now, we've had a huge interest in our seminar today. We've had over 500 signups, and last time I looked, we were at 124 participants here in the Zoom room. So I'm just excited about this, and thank you for your patience as we've tried to navigate the technical aspects of delivering the seminar both through Zoom and live through YouTube. So the format of today's talk will be as follows. During the seminar, you can enter your questions in the chat box. For those who are watching the live stream, you can email your questions directly to Pawn. She'll collect the questions and then send them to me, and we'll do our best to get to them, all of them as we can during the question and answer session before we reach the top of the hour. For now, I think it's time to introduce our speaker, Professor Ilan Kelman. Professor Kelman is Professor of Disasters in Health at University College London, England, and he's Professor too at the University of Agder in Kristiansand, Norway. His overall research interest is linking disasters and health, including the integration of climate change into disaster research and health research. He's the author of a new book, Disaster by Choice, published by Oxford University Press. And the title of his talk today is Disaster by Choice: Why Disasters Are Not Natural. Professor Kelman, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. Thank you also to everyone for coming and joining us in this. It is particularly interesting that we do have all this interest in disasters, and I know many people here have worked extensively in order to try to deal with disasters, prevent them, and help those in the aftermath. And now, in a sense, we are on this venue simply because of a major disaster, one which affects the globe, one which is long-term, although actually all disasters, in a sense, are long-term according to the theory. And because so many people are always affected in disasters, where do the spatial boundaries really stop? So yes, it is interesting and easy to potentially describe the pandemic as a disaster which is long-term and which is spatially diffuse in terms of affecting everyone. But we need to consider, in fact, whether and how that may apply to all forms of disaster, which really sort of leads to the question, what is a disaster? And there are dozens of glossaries out there, if not more. There are books written with the title, What is a Disaster? Plenty of academic papers looking at it. And of course, we can go to dictionaries, whether in English or our own or other languages, in order to try and say, well, not only disaster, but what about synonyms such as catastrophe, such as calamity, such as crisis, such as emergency? What I've tried to do is bring these all together and say, well, fundamentally, what are we talking about? And so I have decided to really distill it to as few words as possible, coming up with 7 in terms of considering a disaster to be a situation requiring outside support for coping. This idea matches many aspects at the international level, such as from the United Nations. It represents ideas which are in much national legislation and subnational legislation, as well as thinking about individuals or families or households and what might mean a disaster to them, even if it appears that very few people outside that are affected. So simply, something happens, it's a situation, we cannot deal with it ourselves, and so to cope with it, we require outside help, external assistance. This sort of raises a question in terms of what do we actually mean by outside? What do we mean by external? Where do we draw the boundaries? Who is necessarily internal? Who is necessarily outside? And how do we work through all of the connections by the fact that, for example, we have 100 people here around the world brought together through amazing technology because of this ongoing situation, this global disaster. So yes, calling it a situation requiring outside support for coping absolutely has vagueness. But when we are talking about language, when we are simply communicating, vagueness always occurs. To me, what I like about it is that the words are relatively straightforward, even being simple but not simplistic. The idea, at least to me and to I think a lot of people, is very understandable, and there are intuitive aspects to it as well as technical aspects. And it does work across many, although certainly not all versions of English. Now, whether that applies to other languages and other cultures, of course, is a question, which becomes even more nebulous when we say, well, okay, so what? So it's a situation requiring outside support for coping, but what are the elements of it? And fundamentally, from decades of disaster research policy and practice, as well as I would contend with perhaps millennia of philosophy, there are 2 main elements in which we can distill when we talk about this sort of situation. And those elements are hazard and vulnerability. Hazard in itself is a rather peculiar word because it actually frequently does not translate. Within this context, we're more or less talking about a phenomenon or a process which often comes from nature. So we're thinking tsunami, volcanic eruption, flood, landslide, tornado, hurricane, cyclone, typhoon, and of course, a virus or a bacteria or a prion. It doesn't necessarily have to come directly from nature. Certainly humans have extensive influences on floods, on landslides, on earthquakes, on microbes which are perhaps created. And also we need to think about those beyond the ones which are natural or hazards or which necessarily transcend the human natural boundary, because if we're talking about chemical leaks, pollution, explosions, those are all hazards which are entirely coming from humanity. As well as thinking wider, which is where sort of the boundaries may start to blur. If we talk about a riot or civil unrest, if we talk about poverty, if we talk about oppression, inequity, injustice, what is a hazard? Or what are the hazards? Are these simply societal phenomena or processes which we create, usually deliberately, some with inadvertent aspects? Or are we starting to sort of drill down and realize that our vocabulary is not always that useful or that precise to really try and understand how does this situation arise, which requires external support for coping? But if we're simply talking about nature, again, the virus, the volcanic eruption, the earthquake, and so forth, then that event or process, that so-called hazard, is very clear. But that in itself, simply a change in the environment, quickly like a tornado or slowly like a drought, doesn't really say anything about how we can deal with it. Because some people know what to do in an earthquake, some people do not. Some people are in structures which are going to withstand that windstorm. Some people are not. Some people have choices to say, you know what? I'm going to go out and get insurance, whether it's travel insurance or home insurance or medical insurance for traveling, in case a hazard occurs and causes damage. Other people can't afford insurance or don't even know what it is. or stuck in a system where no insurance which is useful and usable for them is actually available. So this is very much where the definition of disaster comes into that element of needing to cope with that hazard. And this element or process is vulnerability. How society does and does not deal with these hazards. How society can and cannot deal with these hazards. It's basically a societal process setting up people and communities to be harmed by the hazards or potential hazards. Perhaps poorly constructed buildings, perhaps breaking planning or zoning regulations or not having them. Maybe there are plenty of warning messages out there, but they're not in a language which we speak, or they're put out in media to which we do not have access, which don't work for us. It could simply be that we know exactly what we need to do and where we need to go, but we're scared to go outside because we fear assault in the street or even in an evacuation shelter. So this means that the issue is not so much the hazard, it's actually really this requirement for external support for coping, which is definitional disaster, coming from this vulnerability process, which is fine in theory. But what does it really mean for people affected? Well, let's take an example of earthquakes. And let's think about the fact that, okay, the earthquake is a hazard, generally natural, although there are many ways in which we do create earthquakes or create the earthquake forces which affect infrastructure. But how many people really have their deaths caused by earthquakes? And that phrasing is deliberate. How many people have their deaths caused by earthquakes? So many of you are already thinking, well, obviously the answer is 0. Because the mantra is that earthquakes do not kill people, collapsing infrastructure does. We know how to build infrastructure to withstand all manners and modes of shaking. Sometimes we do, sometimes we do not. And the evidence is simply in the data. So Haiti, 12th January 2010, shallow earthquake, fairly large, I mean, not excessive, but certainly large, and one of the largest earthquake-related death tolls in human history. Not earthquake caused, but there was an earthquake, so earthquake related, simply by a fairly large but not excessive earthquake. Compared to Japan, on the 11th March 2011, which absolutely massive earthquake, absolutely in the top half dozen ever recorded by humanity. And the number of people who died in the earthquake, and it was almost 0. There were potentially some collapses, there were potentially infrastructure bricks falling on people. But for that size of earthquake, with high rises swaying back and forth in Tokyo, remarkably low death toll in the earthquake. And of course, those high rises were swaying back and forth because that's what they were meant to do. If they didn't, they would have collapsed and killed thousands. So in Japan, infrastructure was designed for earthquakes. In Haiti, it wasn't. We see a vast, vast difference in the hazard, that the earthquake was far more powerful in Japan than Haiti, and yet a vast, vast difference in the disaster and the outcome, which was far worse in Haiti than Japan, at least for the earthquake, because there was this event after the earthquake of the tsunami. And that tsunami had an absolutely horrible death toll. In Japan, over 15,000, maybe as much as 20,000. It obviously took out the nuclear power plant, even when they knew that this could happen in this sort of scenario, which devastated people even more, requiring the evacuation, as well as the nuclear contamination. So again, Japan made a decision. They made the decision to deal with the earthquake hazard, but not in particular the tsunami hazard. They created, they built, they chose vulnerability to tsunamis, but not to earthquakes. So this is very clearly illustrates a theory regarding what causes that disaster and why the disaster has to have that element of coping, why the disaster is caused by vulnerability and not by hazard. We can also apply this to our current situation, the ongoing pandemic of COVID-19. So if we think about the hazard, it's a virus, and we really messed that one up. We know that we need international surveillance and monitoring. We know that plenty of microbes do emerge. We've had this before in terms of specific coronaviruses, such as MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and SARS, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. We've obviously had Ebola recently. We had the H1N1 pandemic, flu pandemic in 2009. So we know this is going to happen, which means we have set up some level of surveillance and monitoring at the international level with international cooperation and the legally binding international health regulations, but it simply wasn't good enough. And we knew it wasn't good enough. We knew this could happen. There were so many pandemic plans on the shelf gathering dust rather than actually gathering attention, which meant that when the hazard did emerge, our response was simply inadequate to try and prevent the disaster. We need to think about the fact that many of the medical personnel in the center of where the virus emerged were on it immediately. They reported this bizarre new form of pneumonia. Is it some sort of flu? We don't quite know, and actually very quickly identified the virus and had some of the characteristics. But then the authorities' response was to silence many of those doctors, to intimidate them, to say, how dare you report that there is a public health hazard? Well, we saw the consequences. So here we had plenty of ideas, plenty of chances, plenty of choices to manage the hazard of a new virus, and the choices were simply made not to do so. It goes wider though, because even when the hazard escaped from the place of origin, we then had many other countries who had so many options and actually made very different decisions in terms of how to manage that hazard. What we certainly learned is that decades of underfunding public services, years of austerity, a whole culture of voting, and in many countries where voting is not permitted, a whole culture of devaluing health personnel and health systems meant that there was simply not the preparedness, there was simply not the expertise, there was simply not the ideas or understanding or resources in order to be able to very quickly deal with the hazard in terms of having the appropriate means, mechanisms, and people. Even the fact that one of the richest countries in the world, one of the countries which has showed what they think is democracy and freedom, and how people can actually live their lives how they choose, this country does not even have universal health coverage. How can we begin to think that we can deal with a hazard as simple as a new virus when people do not even have basic health care? So this has nothing to do with what happened in a particular country or a particular city in November, December, when that virus first emerged. This even has nothing to do with the different approaches to lockdown or the different travel restrictions, of which Australia, for example, was one of the early ones. This has to do with the long-term deliberate choices to create and perpetuate vulnerabilities in terms of not having basic health systems and enough resources put in to taking care of people when they are ill. So a hazard emerges, and it is not surprising that we get this sort of disaster. And because we knew the vulnerabilities existed, because we know that this is a long-term process of choices which create those vulnerabilities, calling it a black swan is a complete misnomer. Even if the hazard was not predictable, and of course we knew this was going to happen. I mean, there's papers published a few years ago talking about the fact we need to be alert for new coronaviruses. But even if we accept a sudden, surprising new hazard, it's still not a black swan as a disaster because we knew the vulnerabilities were there. We knew a pandemic would happen. We knew that we were not ready. So we need to dismiss this notion of, oh, these big, unpredictable, unexpected events, when the disaster is the long-term choices, when the cause of disaster is the vulnerabilities, which all we need to do is look around and we can see them. This, though, does not dismiss the vulnerability which was present regarding COVID-19, because we knew, for example, that the way we are interacting with nature actually causes vulnerabilities and creates the conditions whereby microbes may jump species. We've seen this before. Swine flu, Ebola, HIV. All of those were about us encroaching into the environment, wanton ecosystem destruction, not having proper hygiene when dealing with animals. All of them led to viruses jumping from other species to humans. And although we don't know for certain, this also appears, at least for the moment, to have been the origin of the current coronavirus. So we create these vulnerabilities. We create these conditions. We decide how we as a society are going to deal with animals and ecosystems. And fine, if we want to cut down the forest, if we want to just go out there and not have proper hygiene practices when dealing with animals, then we need to know we need to accept the consequences, because we do know what they are. And similarly, even when the vulnerabilities were evident, they were denied. So once a virus had appeared, once the doctors were reporting this new disease, there was initial denial that human-to-human transmission was possible. There was initial suggestions that, you know what, we have it under control, it's not a problem. So this simply built on the existing vulnerabilities and forced them into a realm where it was too late to try and stop the disaster we see in the pandemic. Even at this stage, decisions were made regarding hazard and vulnerability which created the disaster or stopped it being worse. New Zealand, Australia, Vietnam, Taiwan, Norway to a large extent. Several other countries made very clear and deliberate decisions that they didn't want as many people, or they didn't want too many people to die. There is a cost to lockdown. We are seeing it in terms of mental health impacts, increased domestic violence, increased self-harm, people losing jobs, people losing livelihoods and devastated. By the time we had to make the decision between thousands dead or millions out of work and locked down, we were far, far behind where we needed to be. It was already too late. But nonetheless, many countries made that decision and are actually coming out of lockdown now, as opposed to the UK being one of the latest countries within Europe to go into lockdown, as opposed to the US, which is leading the world in so many of these awful statistics per capita as well as absolute numbers, simply because they didn't want that lockdown. So the fact that we have to decide between overturning our society completely and far too many funerals shows how badly we failed over the long term with respect to hazard and vulnerability. So again, we're simply creating vulnerabilities by having the choice of dying or being in lockdown. All of these, though, are choices, and politicians are in the very unenviable regime or decision of having to make those choices. And the way they've made those decisions really shows the difference between those who care about people in the long term and those who are simply looking at values of money without considering the value of people and without considering the value of society. So the pandemic is a disaster. Both lockdown and the number of dead people and infected people are elements of disaster. All of them came from choices which we made about both hazards and vulnerabilities over the long term as well as in the short term. All of these also, you see all the different aspects going into it. We need economists, we need epidemiologists, we need doctors, we need sociologists, we need political scientists, we need behavioral scientists and decision makers, as well as sort of nurses and all the other people who are caring for those who are sick, which means that it's about working together. It's about interdisciplinarism. And we had one earlier question from Fenke who sort of said, well, when we have a highly technical project, say disaster risk reduction project, how do we bring in social scientists? How do we bring in the aspects of people to the engineers, planners, architects, medical professionals, and others who may be focused on the technical? And the answer is, yeah, it's challenging. But by recognizing that we're all in it together, by respecting people's differences and similarities, by looking at all the successes, then absolutely, we need everyone working on this together, communicating with each other and trying. And although we have so many examples of failures, some of which I've gone over now, we also have many examples of successes. One example I can give is I just edited a special issue of the International Journal of Disaster Risk Science on the 5th birthday of the International Agreement for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Sendai Framework. One of those papers, and I think the author is on this call, is about being a sociologist within a technical unit in Brazil to deal with early warnings. And the tagline is, what is a sociologist doing here? It's like, well, hang on a minute. Disasters deal with people, warnings are about people, so of course we need someone who deals with people, except that it's not always that obvious to those involved in it. So congratulations to Victor for what he has done and is doing in Brazil, and being able to also articulate it so coherently within this paper, which is free to download, to show us the successes and the lessons to think about and how we can branch out and deal with different people. Certainly, a lot of the work which I do these days is social and political science, but my 3 degrees are engineering. So my PhD was integrating in multiple dimensions, and I had to set up those equations from scratch. Then I decided that I wanted to think about the planning implications and the governance implications. So what it shows is that with the correct environment, with the ability to support creativity, we can cross those boundaries. We can be both an engineer and a sociologist. We can be non-disciplinary, thinking about how to solve problems, thinking about actual approaches to say, what tools do we have? What is our repertoire? How can we move forward with what we know while circumventing what we don't know? Or maybe call it all disciplinary, because we need that sociologist and we need that engineer. And we need the correct people who are trained in the right way, who can communicate across the actual languages and cultures, but really the disciplines, to bring their own discipline to other homes. And again, it's really learning from the successes. It's saying, how can we just step back and listen to each other, talking with, not necessarily talking at, in order to move forward and recognize that if we had come together in this way, we could have stopped that Haiti earthquake disaster. We could have stopped that Japan tsunami disaster. We could have stopped the pandemic disaster, which is ongoing, while also thinking about how to cross further boundaries and very much apply it to many other global challenges, which are very hazard-based. One of which, of course, and which is also being impacted by the pandemic, is climate change. So there's so much discussion going on, saying, you know what? They told us we could never stop flights. They told us we could never shut down the roads. It would just be too devastating. Well, a virus appears and we've actually done quite well, except that, you know what? It has been devastating because so many people are suffering because of the lockdowns. It really comes down to the fact that we ended up with 2 choices, which were unenviable. And I think that some of the governments which have succeeded are absolutely to be commended. And we can learn so much from it when we are looking to the future, post-COVID-19, to consider, what does this mean for something like climate change? Well, let's then go back to the definition of disaster: a situation requiring outside support for coping with hazard and vulnerability. So what is climate change? And actually, by definition, climate change is literally a change in the climate, which sort of has logic to it, but that's how the United Nations definitions start out. So what is climate? Well, climate by definition is average weather. Where does weather appear in disaster? Weather is just hazard. Therefore, by definition, climate change is not a disaster. And by definition, climate change does not cause disasters. What climate change does is influence some hazards. There is no doubt climate change is happening. There is no doubt we are causing it. There is no doubt that the rapidity of the changes we are seeing are quite exceptional in the Earth's history and are absolutely changing the weather now. We can see that signal. But that is only weather. We should be able to deal with floods. Often we can't, because of vulnerability, not because of the flood. We should be able to deal with wind. Often we can't, Not because of the wind speed, not because of the wind direction, not because of the wind level, not because of the wind parameters, but because of vulnerability. Climate change is absolutely influencing tropical cyclones. So we're talking about hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons. It is projected to decrease frequency. Climate change is projected to make fewer tropical cyclones, but to increase intensity. So we're going to have more rainfall. It looks like the tropical cyclones are moving slower along their tracks because of climate change. And so it means a lot more rainfall is going to be dumped in one place, which is problematic if we have vulnerability to rainfall. So the answer, let's deal with vulnerability. If we solve vulnerability, if we solve the fundamental cause of disasters, then climate change would not be an issue. Now, there are many other reasons for trying to tackle climate change. But to claim that climate change is increasing and causing disasters is not scientifically defensible, with some exceptions. Typically, heat waves we can deal with. We choose not to, but we can deal with them. The challenge with climate change is that it's pushing heat and humidity combinations into realms where it's going to be that hot and humid for so long that outside you're dead. And it's not going to cool down at night to let people survive. Where survival is impossible without the technical solution of indoor cooling, then that is absolutely a hazard cause disaster. Knock-on effects are terrifying. If you're dead outside, we can't have outdoor labor, which includes agriculture. So climate change, heating up the atmosphere, leading to heat-humidity combinations beyond human survival, are going to interrupt our food supply, are going to make large swaths of land uninhabitable, and this is directly a disaster caused by climate change. It is terrifying. Forget all the other reasons about tackling climate change. If you want to convince people, look at the projections for heat. That's all we need to know in order to say we need to stop climate change and we need to stop it now. But let's not get distracted from the fact that all the other influences on climate change are merely weather, and we should be able to deal with weather. We just make the decision that we're not going to. Same with other huge hazards which may take out the planet, like Earth impacts. We're talking asteroids or comets slamming into the Earth. This sounds ridiculous. I mean, we cannot reduce planet-wide vulnerability unless we're going to put everyone on rocket ships and go off to another planet. What we can do, though, is deal with the hazard. We know these objects exist. We know there have been calamities, huge explosions, huge tsunamis from them in the past. All we need to do is have a warning and monitoring system. We actually are doing quite well at monitoring, which means we'll have the warning. It's a response system to an incoming asteroid or comet, which is a problem because we're not fully ready for it. And it's ironic that so many of the trade-offs actually work in our favor. So the faster an object goes and the bigger it is, the worse impact it's going to have. But the faster an object is and the bigger it is, the more chance there is for us to see it in time to act if we're looking. So it is up to us to look. And again, there are some space monitoring systems out there, but they require improvement. And it's up to us to be ready to respond, to deal with the hazard in order to stop the planet-wide vulnerability becoming a disaster. This is all long-term, though. You can't simply set up a comet or near-Earth object warning and monitoring system and response system overnight. It takes a long time and it takes resources, just as with climate change, just as with viruses, just as with all the other hazards. Even Haiti, it did not become an earthquake vulnerable country overnight. People have traced that earthquake vulnerability back 200 years to its independence in 1804, when France and the US in particular decided that they could not have this colony being independent, so let's force them to have reparations, and let's continue influencing and controlling their governance for the next 200 years. So that earthquake vulnerability in Haiti was created over centuries. It takes a long time, which means that these disasters involving all these hazards which I've talked about, these disasters are not events. Like vulnerability, they take a long time to manifest They take a long time to appear. So all disasters are processes. They are not events. And the phrase rapid onset disaster, the phrase fast onset disaster makes no sense. All disasters are slow onset. All disasters are long-term processes caused by the long-term societal and political process of vulnerability, and thus takes a long time to build up, be created, and to manifest, all from our choices. Which means that we can make choices to act. We can actually deal with some of these processes and conditions which lead to vulnerability. And this emerges from one early question which came in from Zubair about the fact that isn't this simply the circumstances people are in? Isn't this poverty which others create? And the answer is absolutely yes. I talk about disaster by choice, and that's very much the title of my book. But whose choice? As mentioned earlier, some people don't have access to insurance. Some people don't even have access to basic health care. Not by their choice, but by the fact that others have chosen to constrain them. By the fact that choices are made by those with power and resources, typically creating and foisting vulnerability on many others. Typically showing that those who should have the knowledge don't have the interest to actually help others and reduce their vulnerabilities. So disaster by choice is sort of this balance between the fact that we cannot just call people victims. Even those who are poor, who are marginalized, who are oppressed, have some modicum of power, have some modicum of resources. And a lot of what we try to do professionally is draw that out, recognize that, give them the power, give them the confidence to say they're in a bad situation, but what can they do while we try to make that situation better? The other balance is how much control those with all the resources and power actually have over us. And even though we are relatively privileged by the fact that we're on this call and thinking about these issues, so much of what we do is still controlled by others, and we don't necessarily have those choices. Can you actually go online and find a floodplain for your residence? A floodplain map for your residence? Well, in the UK, I can. It's not the case for many other countries. Can you go online and find the seismic hazard zone of your location? Well, in some places, yes, in some places, no. So even those amongst of us who are relatively affluent, relatively privileged, don't always have those choices because they're made by other people. So a lot of what we're trying to do, and I'm sure that's why a lot of you are here, is to say, well, okay, that's fine, but what can we do? What should we do? How can we act? And part of it is actually a lot of what people are putting in the comments there, that yes, I mean, the lockdown has also saved many lives, such as from air pollution and such as from vehicle crashes. So what are we going to do ourselves, for example, in order to not live in areas with high air pollution if we have those choices, and also to perhaps be in vehicles which are safer, or to request laws and regulations and monitoring which will make travel by road much safer? Or else how can we act further? By education. So at University College London, starting next September, we are going to have the UK's first Bachelor in Humanitarianism. This is saying, as soon as the students come out of secondary school, think like a humanitarian. So agencies who are out there, if there's any secondary school teachers on this call, think about how to convince the students that from the undergraduate level, they can start tackling disasters and wider issues. And we also have an extensive master's program, sort of Masters of Disasters, or what we hope is a Master of Tackling Disasters. So these are choices that we can make with my director in one of my institutes setting up these programs. These are the choices we can make to encourage students to study humanitarianism at the undergraduate level, disasters at the master's level. These are the choices that we can make to say we know the hazards are there, from asteroids to viruses, from landslides to volcanic eruptions. And yesterday was the 40th anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption in Washington State. So we should act, we can act, The real question is within what constraints do each of us have? What options do each of us have? How can we bring out the power and resources from those who are too frequently marginalized, oppressed, with their options, their choices taken away? What are we all going to do to move together, to act together, to recognize that we are in this together as one species and one planet, so that disaster by choice becomes no disaster by choice? Thank you very much. I'm looking forward now to hearing the questions and even hopefully some answers from you, because I certainly do not have all the answers. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Ilan. We have received several questions. Raymond Pena from FEMA in the United States asks, is it a disaster if it only affects one individual?
Because the definition is subjective in terms of being a situation requiring external support for coping, there are plenty of disasters which, yes, affect only one individual. So some people, for example, if they have a medical diagnosis, which has a potential for being terminal or long-term treatment, they have severe challenges for that, and they absolutely need external support. Even if, vehicle crashes was mentioned earlier, to have someone close to you perish in a vehicle crash can just upend your life, completely overturn everything you have. And whether it's financial support, whether it's mental health support, whether it's simply support for selling your property and changing your life to move into another one, that is very much a personal disaster and absolutely very much an individual disaster.
Great. From Alexander Preinerstorfer, you made the analogy about a black swan, and he asked, well, would a better analogy perhaps be a gray rhino than a black swan?
Yeah, it's a thing sort of, well, when you hear hooves, of course, you think of zebras and you forget about horses. It's sort of saying, well, how are different analogies relevant? What do they mean to different people? And should we even be using animals and colors? So for some people, a gray rhino is just day to day. And that's just perfectly typical. Other people may never have seen a gray rhino, even behind bars, even in a cage. So when we are trying to communicate and deal with these issues, for me, it's about being scientifically accurate, and black swan simply is not. But it's also finding the analogies, the parallels of communication, which works. And a lot of people, rather than gray rhino, say, well, it's the elephant in the room, vulnerability. And you have to have the jazz hands, right? Elephant in the room. For other people, the analogy actually doesn't make sense and they don't understand it. So if gray rhino works for you, go for it. But just be aware, for different audiences, it may not be appropriate.
Manuela Fernandez asks, what are the vulnerabilities chosen, and she put chosen in quotes, in the context of COVID? What are the vulnerabilities chosen in the context of COVID?
Well, it's very contextual. In the UK, one big vulnerability was not having an adequate health system. That came through very clearly in the fact that they had to cancel numerous cancer treatments, for example. And there is no doubt that cancer mortality is going to spike substantially in the UK because the health system cannot cope with it. Clear vulnerability. Over 150 frontline health workers have died of COVID-19 in the UK. That is unacceptable. Simply because they did not have the protective equipment, they did not have the political support to do their job without being directly exposed to the disease to the point that it's being fatal. Wider vulnerabilities relate to lockdown. People say that COVID-19 has caused major problems for our economic system. It's actually not true. What COVID-19 has shown is the major vulnerabilities which the economic system causes. So the economic system is a cause of vulnerabilities rather than itself being hurt or harmed by the situation. Because the vulnerabilities are that so many people don't have the resources to live beyond a single paycheck. So yeah, lockdown is understandable. It has saved tens of thousands of lives. The fact that people have been made unemployed is devastating, but if the societal support were there for them, it wouldn't be as devastating. The key economic vulnerability is the fact that so many people are surviving paycheck to paycheck. The key vulnerability is that so many governments and societies are not willing to step in to help these people survive, to keep their livelihoods going, and to give them hope, optimism, and something fruitful to do day to day during lockdown, while they also have to cope with the stress of having zero money in the bank. So it's not so much the virus or the pandemic, it's these knock-on impacts which really show how awful the vulnerabilities are that we've created across society.
And that's a good transition to the next question from Amit Sinha from India. He asks, in reference to the ongoing pandemic, how do these economic impacts that you mentioned, how do we reduce them in the future? And maybe that's kind of obvious from what you said, but if you wanted to elaborate.
Well, I would start fundamentally by valuing people and society rather than valuing economic indicators. So we do have an option now to try to do better. At the smaller scale level, many cities are saying now that roads don't have traffic, let's try and open up with more cycle lanes and with better pedestrian access. So again, it's about reducing air pollution. It's about making cities and other places more livable and safe for cyclists and pedestrians. But it's also thinking fundamentally, again, about not just these economic impacts, but why do so few people have access to healthcare? Why do we have to kill so many people by less cancer treatment in order to stop the health system being overwhelmed by a coronavirus? What are we going to do to ensure that so many people are not surviving paycheck to paycheck, but perhaps we do need to implement rolling lockdowns, or we need to think about creative ways of continuing livelihoods without devastating people? But people have actually been thinking about this for decades. I mean, you can go back to Schumacher in 1972, Small is Beautiful. You can go to steady state economies, circular economies, donut economics, the environmentalism movements, deep ecology, again, started in the late 60s, early 70s. All of this is there. Now is our chance to implement it. And so much is going to be contextual. The question came from India. I have no idea what India needs. I have no recommendations. What I can say is where I live, London, needs much better cycling and walking access, and we have the opportunity. The UK needs a government which cares about healthcare and health systems, and particularly health workers. And we need a society which is much less focused on, well, what is the GDP and how rich can billionaires get, and much more focused on what most of the population on the ground are experiencing day to day, why they do not have fulfilling livelihoods, and why their jobs can barely put enough food on the table.
Great. From Ivanka Kabakchieva in Sofia University, she asks, while your lecture proposes an interesting frame of reference for thinking about hazards and disasters, given the large number of possible hazards we're presented with as a society and the practically limited ways to prepare for them, how is it practically applicable to risk management? In other words, how do we manage all this?
No, I mean, the question about there are so many hazards is exactly right, which is why we need to focus on vulnerabilities. If we reduce vulnerability to one hazard, in most instances, not all, but in most instances, we reduce vulnerabilities to a huge range of hazards. The people who are vulnerable to floods tend to be vulnerable to viruses, to volcanic eruptions, to windstorms, to tornadoes, to landslides. Also, there is so much that we don't know about hazards, and there's wonderful research going on, whether it's in seismology or hydrology or synoptic meteorology, Dave, many others, and we need that work because there's so much we do not know. What we do know is vulnerability causes disasters. Therefore, rather than being overwhelmed by the huge range of hazards, focus on what we do know, which is the vulnerabilities, and reducing them so that no matter what hazard happens, at least to a large extent, we've avoided a disaster.
So we received a number of questions about kind of the political will and how what you're talking about relates. I mean, how do we get the politics to transform? Because it seems like many of the choices in front of us are all relatively straightforward. So Andrea Lampus writes, when we were writing and researching on the core role of vulnerability and disasters already in the mid 1990s. What has, in your view, prevented a transposition of that critical contribution to other levels? And she says, do not say lack of political will. So what do we need to do to transcend that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental question. And this is really the core of disaster research where we do not have all the answers. What I know is that Andrea and Victor and some of the others actually know the answer to this question much better than me, and definitely go to their writings and think about what they offer. What I can offer is success stories. So we know that Bangladesh in general has actually done very well in terms of reducing cyclone mortality. So they've gone from about 500,000 dead in a cyclone in 1970 to really only a couple of hundred in recent cyclones. At the moment, we have a test going on with a massive cyclone making a beeline right up the Bay of Bengal. So in a week or so, we'll know whether or not the success translates. At least what we know is there have been successes there. Similarly, Toronto in Canada. In 1954, Hurricane Hazel slashed through it, killing dozens of people because their houses were in ravines which flash flooded. Within wider context of changes in local municipal governance for Toronto, they made the decision that they were no longer going to have settlements in the floodplains, in the ravines. So when other remnants of hurricanes have gone through, like Sandy and Isabel, there was a lot of flash flooding, a lot of damage to fences and pathways in the ravines, but it wasn't a disaster. I mean, really, not much happened. A lot of basements are still damaged in flash flooding. Toronto still has, as does Bangladesh, still has a prospect for many disasters. But the point is that here are success stories where somehow that political will, that political decision-making was made. We need so much more work to go back into history in Toronto and say, but why? Who did it? Was it a champion? Was it collective? Was there an election? And same with Bangladesh. Why have they done so well, at least until this week with cyclones, but they're waiting to be flattened by an earthquake with very little being done? So hazard dependent, which is ridiculous when the vulnerabilities are the same. So yes, this set of questions is a fundamental core in disaster research, which we're trying to investigate and trying to understand. So please join us.
Great. We've also received a number of questions about climate change, and many of the colleagues or teachers of the speakers here or of the audience have said that they don't believe in climate change, and I know you commented about, well, climate change is not the real factor that we need to deal with. It's the vulnerabilities, irrespective of the fact that climate is changing. And so is there, I mean, how do we change that narrative? In other words, how do we kick that out and say, well, look, it's not really about climate change. I mean, of course, we have to believe in it, and we know it's happening, but let's not make that limit the things that we can do to improve our societal resilience. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's two threads here. And for me, the narrative is the same. The narrative is read the science and listen to the science. So there's a lot of rhetoric out there and a lot of propaganda about how climate change is going to kill us all and climate change is causing all those disasters. That is not scientifically defensible. Again, if you tweet me or email me, I can send you a whole list of papers describing what I described here about why climate change does not cause disasters. It is the hazard influencer, with some exceptions, and heat is a big exception. So we have to change that narrative to vulnerability, not hazard causing disasters. As for the narrative about hazards not existing, I mean, if you say, I don't believe in climate change, why do you believe in earthquakes? Why do you believe in volcanic eruptions? So again, just go to the scientific literature. There are all sorts of problems with some of the collations, such as a big one called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Don't worry about that. Go to the basic papers. They are free to download. You can look at what's being published today, what was published last week on why climate change exists. Simply go online, download the PDFs, read them, and you will find that the science is there, that climate change is happening, we are causing it, and it is influencing the weather now, including the projections that it's going to cause these devastating heat wave disasters, which are very worrying. So the narrative is believe the science. And if you do not believe climate change science, then you do not believe gravity.
Good one. We're also receiving a number of questions that relate to poverty, where the risks that people live under are very clearly exposed. They got no health care insurance. Maybe their housing isn't adequate. And so some of the questions that we're getting is, if we can't implement simple things like recycling programs and making even small changes, that would reduce our impact on climate change, that would also contribute to reducing poverty and increasing personal finance, then how do we tackle these bigger challenges, that pertain to poverty? And I think, for me personally, as a meteorologist researcher, that's one of the things that propelled me into, this more interdisciplinary thinking, that, sure, we can improve forecasts after a while and we can do certain things, but, ultimately other things have to happen in order to reduce the suffering that we're experiencing. How do we do that in these perpetually impoverished areas?
Yeah, and it goes back to that question on political will from Andrea. Fundamentally, we don't have the full answers. What we do know is, in theory, what we should be doing and the goal we need to reach. We also have many examples of successes that we can look at from human history. So one example is that in the UK, from the start of the suffragist movement, it took 50 years, 2 generations before women were given the vote. And now I hope no one would even think twice. Of course, women and men should have the vote. So this is an example of how long the change took, how many people suffered and also died for it, but we got there. And it's going to be the same with wealth inequity, with resource allocation, with poverty, with these questions. People are doing amazing work at dealing with it. We have a long way to go and we've had many setbacks. Ultimately, for me, it's looking at what has succeeded and trying to get those lessons, but also joining us and saying we don't have all the answers. We don't know what will work specifically, but we need to continue working towards that. We need to continue collaborating in order to do better at the local and international levels.
Right.
And actually, part of that was a question has come through.
Yeah, go ahead.
On sort of summarizing that special issue, which I mentioned, in terms of 2 or 3 successes and also the challenging areas. And a lot of the successes, again, I would simply say, well, read the papers, learn from those authors, because they set them out and they provide lessons and advice for us. The fundamental challenge, which the head of UNDRR actually raises in her contribution to the special issue, is whether or not this form of international agreement really gives us what we need and really is the best way forward. And I think that's what we all need to think about. Do these top-down international collective systems do more good than harm, more harm than good? Or what can we do together to use them in such a way that we achieve these political will and poverty alleviation questions which have come up?
Great. And with that, we're near the top of the hour. So I just want to remind everyone, if you want to follow Ilan and read about some of the papers that he's discussed, he's got quite an extensive webpage where you can learn more. And speaking on behalf of our center, I want to remind you about the seminar series that we're hosting. And next week, same bat time, same bat channel, we'll be here with Dr. Rob DeLeo from Bentley University, Always Unprepared, How Politics Undermines Disaster Preparedness and What to Do About It. So thank Ilan once again. Thank you for coming. And we'll see you next week, hopefully. Bye.
Thank you.